My husband's coworker calls him late at night for work stuff. When I asked him to set a boundary, he said I was being controlling. I want to start by saying I am not someone who reads my husband's phone, who shows up unannounced at his office, or who has ever once accused him of anything without reason. We have been married 11 years, and for 10 of them I would have told you, without hesitation, that I trusted him completely. Then, about 4 months ago, his coworker Brianna started calling him after 9 most weeknights, sometimes as late as 11, always described afterward as work stuff. And when I finally asked him to simply set a boundary around it, he told me I was being controlling. I have thought about that word for 4 months now, turning it over, trying to figure out whether I'm the problem here, or whether something reasonable got mislabeled as something it isn't. My name is Rebecca, and I'm 42 years old, and I want to be clear from the start that this isn't a story I'm telling because I caught my husband Dan doing something dramatic. I haven't found messages I wasn't supposed to see, haven't discovered anything that would constitute proof of an affair in the way these stories sometimes go. What I have is something quieter and, in some ways, harder to explain to people, because it sounds small when I say it out loud, and yet it has occupied a genuine amount of space in my marriage over the past several months. Dan works as a project manager at a mid-sized architecture firm in Cincinnati, a job he's held for 6 years and generally enjoys. About 8 months ago, the firm hired a new project coordinator named Brianna, who works closely with Dan on several ongoing projects. I want to say plainly that I have met Brianna exactly twice, at firm holiday parties, and she seemed perfectly pleasant both times, friendly in the unremarkable way coworkers are friendly at a work function. I have no specific grievance against her as a person. This story isn't about her character. It's about a pattern that developed between her and my husband that I genuinely did not know how to name for a long time. It started, as far as I can tell, around late February. Dan mentioned a few times that Brianna had texted him something about a project deadline after hours, which struck me as completely unremarkable. Plenty of people text about work outside normal hours occasionally, and I didn't think twice about it. By March, the texts had become calls, and the calls had started happening later in the evening, usually after our daughter Maya, who's 7, had gone to bed, which meant Dan would step into our home office to take them, closing the door, not in a way that felt dramatic or secretive exactly, but in a way that became a recognizable pattern over the following weeks. What was that about? I'd ask when he came back to the living room. Just work stuff, he'd say. She's stressed about the Hendricks project, wanted to talk through some scheduling things. I believed him. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters for understanding how this developed. I didn't suspect anything in March. I simply noticed, the way you notice a sound in a house that you can't quite place yet, that this was happening with increasing frequency, and that the calls were lasting longer each time. By April, the calls were happening close to every weeknight, usually starting around 9, sometimes lasting 45 minutes or longer. I started noticing the specific texture of these evenings, Dan glancing at his phone when it lit up, a slight change in his posture, a kind of low-grade distraction that settled over him for the rest of the night even after the call ended. I brought it up for the first time on a Tuesday evening in mid-April, trying to keep my tone genuinely curious rather than accusatory, because at that point I didn't feel accusatory. I felt confused. Does Brianna call other people on the team this late too? I asked. Or is it mostly just you? Dan was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone deciding how to answer a question that's slightly more pointed than the ones that came before it. I think she calls me because I'm the project lead on most of what she's working on, he said. I don't really know what calls she's making to other people. It just seems like a lot, I said. Almost every night, sometimes for a long time. It's a busy season, he said. The Hendricks project has a tight deadline, and honestly, she's still pretty new, so she checks in more than someone with more experience might need to. It was a reasonable explanation on its surface. I want to acknowledge that, because I think it's important to this story that nothing Dan said in those early conversations was implausible. Architecture firms do have busy seasons. New employees do sometimes need more guidance. None of what he was telling me was, on its face, a lie I could point to. What I couldn't quite get past was the feeling underneath the explanation. Not a feeling of certainty that something was happening, but a feeling that something had shifted in the texture of our evenings that I didn't have language for yet, and that every time I tried to find that language, I ended up sounding, even to myself, like I was reaching for a problem that might not exist. I talked to my friend Angela about it over coffee in late April, mostly because I needed to say it out loud to someone outside the marriage to figure out if I was overreacting. How often exactly? Angela asked, after I'd laid out the pattern as evenly as I could. Almost every weeknight at this point, I said. Sometimes for 30 minutes, sometimes longer. And he says it's all work? He says it's all work. Angela was quiet for a moment, stirring her coffee. I'm not going to tell you what to think, she said. But I will say, my husband works with plenty of women, and none of them call him at 9 at night on a near-daily basis about scheduling. I think there's a difference between occasional after-hours work contact, which is normal, and a pattern this consistent and this long. I'm not saying anything's happening. I'm saying the pattern itself is worth paying attention to, separate from whether you can prove anything. That distinction mattered to me. The idea that I didn't need to have proof of something specific to have a legitimate concern about a pattern. I had been operating, without quite realizing it, under the assumption that unless I could point to something concrete, like a message I wasn't supposed to see, I had no real grounds to say anything. Angela's framing helped me understand that wasn't actually true. A pattern can be its own kind of evidence, even without a smoking gun behind it. I decided after that conversation that I needed to talk to Dan directly about the pattern itself, not about Brianna specifically, and not in a way that accused him of anything. I wanted to ask for something concrete and reasonable. Not that he stop working with her. Not that he report every conversation to me, but simply that the after-hours calls have some kind of boundary around them, the way I think most people would consider reasonable in a marriage, regardless of who the other person was. I waited for a calm evening, after Maya was asleep, before bringing it up again, more directly this time than I had in April. I want to talk about the calls with Brianna, I said. Not because I think something's happening. I want to be clear about that. But I think it would be reasonable to ask that work calls happen during work hours, or at least not stretch into 9, 10, 11 at night, multiple times a week. That feels like a fair boundary to ask for, regardless of who's on the other end of the phone. Dan looked at me for a moment, and something in his expression shifted in a way that surprised me, given how carefully I'd tried to frame the request. You're asking me to control when a coworker can contact me about work, he said. That feels like a pretty controlling thing to ask, Rebecca. I sat with that word for a long moment before I said anything else, because I wanted to be sure I responded to what he'd actually said, rather than to the hurt underneath hearing it. I'm not asking you to control when she can contact you, I said carefully. I'm asking you to set a boundary around when you respond to those contacts. Those are different things. If she texts you at 10 at night about a deadline, you can answer it the next morning unless something is actually on fire. I'm not asking you to police her behavior. I'm asking you to manage your own. It's not that simple, Dan said. If I don't respond, she thinks I'm not taking the project seriously. There's a lot riding on the Hendricks deadline, and if things fall behind because I didn't get back to her quickly, that reflects on me, not on her. Has anything actually been on fire during any of these calls, I asked? Or has it mostly been the kind of thing that genuinely could wait until the next morning? He didn't answer that directly, which told me something on its own. I think you're making this bigger than it is, he said instead. It's work. It happens to be a busy season. I don't understand why this is becoming a whole conversation about boundaries and control, because it's been almost every weeknight for 2 months, I said. Because our evenings have started revolving around whether your phone is going to light up around 9. Because when I bring up something that feels reasonable to me, the response is that I'm being controlling, instead of us actually talking through whether the pattern itself makes sense. He was quiet for a moment. I think I just feel like you don't trust that this is actually about work, he said finally, and that stings, honestly. 11 years and you're acting like I can't have a coworker who calls me sometimes without it being some kind of threat. I haven't accused you of anything, I said. I want to be really clear about that, because I think somewhere in this conversation, you're hearing an accusation that I'm not actually making. I'm not saying something is happening between you and Brianna. I'm saying the pattern of late-night calls, regardless of what's actually being discussed on them, isn't something I think is reasonable for our marriage, and I'd like us to address that together. The conversation didn't resolve that night. We went to bed in a kind of careful quiet that wasn't quite a fight, but wasn't our normal rhythm either. Both of us, I think, turning the conversation over privately without saying much more out loud. Over the following 2 weeks, I noticed something that bothered me more than the calls themselves had. A kind of vigilance had crept into how I was experiencing our evenings. I found myself watching the clock, watching Dan's phone, noticing his posture shift when it lit up, in a way I had never done before in 11 years of marriage. I didn't like the person this was turning me into, and I said as much to Angela over coffee again, in early May. I don't want to be someone who checks her husband's phone or counts the minutes of his calls, I said. But I also don't know how to stop noticing it once I've started. That's actually a pretty normal response to feeling dismissed, Angela said. When someone tells you you're imagining a problem, or that your concern is actually the problem, you don't usually relax. You usually start gathering evidence because some part of you needs to know whether you're crazy or whether you're right. I don't think that makes you controlling. I think that makes you someone whose reasonable concern got labeled as something it wasn't. And now you're stuck holding both the original concern and the discomfort of being told you shouldn't have it. That distinction helped me untangle something I'd been sitting with uncomfortably, and the difference between being genuinely controlling, which would mean trying to restrict who Dan could talk to or monitor his communications, and simply wanting wanting a boundary around timing that had nothing to do with restricting his relationships and everything to do with protecting the shape of our evenings together. I raised it again. Differently this time, on a Sunday afternoon when we weren't in the middle of an evening where the issue was actively happening, which I'd realized in retrospect made it easier for both of us to get defensive in the moment. I want to come back to the conversation from a couple weeks ago, I said, but I want to try it differently. I'm not interested in relitigating whether I trust you or whether I'm being controlling. I want to ask you something specific. Would you be willing to tell Brianna that you're generally not available for calls after 8, except for genuine emergencies, and direct her to email or text things that can wait until morning? Dan was quiet for a moment. I guess I could do that, he said slowly. I think part of why I haven't is that it feels awkward to bring up with her specifically. Like I'd be making it a bigger deal than it needs to be. It might feel awkward for 30 seconds. I said, but I think it's a completely normal thing to say to any coworker, male or female. Hey, I'm trying to keep work stuff to work hours unless it's truly urgent is not a strange or dramatic thing to say. Plenty of people set that boundary without it being a whole conversation. I think I've just gotten used to being available, he said. It probably became a habit before I even noticed it becoming one. That's exactly why I think it's worth actually naming and changing, I said. Not because something's wrong, necessarily, but because a habit that's eating into almost every evening, regardless of what's actually being discussed, isn't a habit I think either of us would have chosen on purpose if we'd thought it through from the start. I want to be honest that this conversation went better than the first one, but it didn't fully resolve things either. Dan agreed in the moment that he'd talked to Brianna about keeping things to work hours, but over the following week, I noticed the calls continuing at roughly the same frequency, which left me wondering whether the conversation with her had actually happened, or whether it had happened in some watered-down version that didn't actually address the timing. I asked him directly, about 10 days after our Sunday conversation, "Did you end up talking to Brianna about the after-hours thing?" "I mentioned it," he said, kind of. I said something like, "Sorry for the late calls. Things have just been busy." I don't know if that really landed as a boundary so much as an apology. Did the calls change at all after that? He was quiet for a second. "Not really," he said. I think I said it more to acknowledge it than to actually ask her to stop. I felt something in my chest tighten at that. Not anger exactly, but a kind of weary recognition that the actual boundary I'd asked for hadn't actually been set, despite the appearance of the conversation having happened. I sat with that for a day before deciding how I wanted to respond to it, because I didn't want to come back at him reactively in a way that would just restart the same defensive cycle we'd been in before. Dan was quiet long enough that I started to wonder if he was going to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost the slight edge it had carried in our previous conversations about this. "I think I like that someone needs me," he said. "I know how that sounds, but Brianna's new. She's genuinely good at her job, but still figuring out the politics of the place. And when she calls and I help her work through something, it feels, I don't know, it feels good. In a way that I think I haven't really examined until you just asked me that question directly." I sat with that for a moment, feeling something complicated settle in my chest. Not quite relief, because what he'd said wasn't entirely comfortable to hear, but something closer to recognition. He'd finally said something true instead of something defensive, and even though the truth wasn't simple, it was at least something we could actually work with. "Can you say more about that?" I asked, keeping my voice as even as I could manage. "At work, a lot of what I do is project management," he said slowly, working through it as he spoke. "Scheduling, budgets, keeping things on track. It's not usually the kind of work where people thank you or notice you specifically. With Brianna, when she calls and I help her figure something out, she's genuinely grateful. Genuinely impressed sometimes. I think some part of me has been getting something out of that I haven't been getting much of anywhere else lately, including here, if I'm honest. Not because you don't appreciate me. I just think somewhere in 11 years and a 7-year-old and 2 full-time jobs, a lot of our conversations have become logistics. Who's picking up Maya? What's for dinner? Did you pay the electric bill? I'm not blaming you for that. I think it's just what happens. But I think the calls with Brianna started filling some gap I hadn't really noticed was there, until you kept asking me to close it. I want to be honest about how that landed, because there's a version of this story where I tell you I felt simple relief that nothing physical or explicitly romantic was happening, and while that relief was real, it sat alongside something harder to hear, that my own marriage had developed a gap that someone else's attention had been filling, even if unintentionally on his part. "I appreciate you telling me that honestly," I said. "I think that's actually more useful to me than if you'd just agreed to set the boundary without us understanding why it had gotten this far in the first place." "No, it doesn't excuse not setting the boundary when you asked," he said. "I think that's part of why I got defensive when you brought it up. Some part of me knew if I really examined it, I'd have to admit I liked the way it felt, and it was easier to just say you were being controlling than to sit with that. I felt something shift in me hearing that. Not full forgiveness yet, because I needed some time to actually process it, but a kind of clarity I hadn't had in the previous 2 months of circling around the issue without ever landing on what was actually underneath it. I think we need to look at 2 separate things, I said. One is the boundary with Brianna, which I still think needs to actually happen. Clearly and directly, not as an apology buried in a sentence. The other is whatever's been missing here that made that gap feel worth filling somewhere else. I don't think those are the same conversation, but I think we need to have both of them. The conversation with Brianna happened the following Monday. Dan told me about it that evening, and I believed him this time, partly because of how he described it, direct, specific, without hedging. He'd told her that he needed to keep work communication to work hours going forward, that anything after 6 should go to email unless it was a genuine emergency, and that he wanted to be clear about that boundary rather than letting it stay vague. How did she take it? I asked. Fine, actually, he said. I think I'd built it up in my head as this huge awkward thing, and it was maybe 30 seconds of slight surprise, and then she just said, okay, no problem. The call stopped almost entirely after that. Not completely. There was one genuine emergency about 3 weeks later, a server issue affecting a project deadline, and Dan took a 15-minute call to help resolve it, which felt entirely reasonable given the actual stakes involved, a different texture entirely from the nightly 45-minute conversations that had become the pattern before. The harder conversation, the one about what had been missing, took longer to work through, and I don't want to pretend it resolved itself in some neat, single dinner conversation the way these things sometimes get described. Dan and I started actually scheduling time together that wasn't just logistics, not anything dramatic, just a standing Friday night where Maya went to my sister's for a sleepover once a month, and Dan and I had dinner together without discussing the electric bill or carpool schedules. We started slowly, talking more about things beyond the daily mechanics of running a household, the way we used to before Maya, before the particular exhaustion of 2 full-time jobs and a school-age kid settled into our default rhythm without either of us quite noticing it happening. I won't say everything is perfectly resolved. I think what I've learned is that a marriage doesn't develop a gap like the one Dan described because anyone did anything wrong exactly. It develops because life gets full, and attention naturally flows toward whatever's asking for it most directly. And sometimes that's a coworker's gratitude instead of a spouse's. Simply because the coworker's gratitude is new and uncomplicated in a way that 11 years of marriage, by its nature, often isn't. What I am glad about is that I didn't accept being called controlling as the end of the conversation. I sat with that word for a long time, genuinely questioning whether it was true, whether I'd crossed some line I hadn't meant to cross. But the more I examined it, the more I understood the difference between controlling someone's relationships and asking for a reasonable boundary around how those relationships intersect with your shared life. Those aren't the same thing. Even when they get described as though they are in the moment, someone doesn't want to examine what's actually happening underneath their own resistance. A few weeks ago, Dan and I were having dinner on one of our now regular Friday nights, and he brought it up himself, unprompted. I keep thinking about calling you controlling, he said. I don't think I'll forget that I said that, especially because you were right and I was the one avoiding something. I appreciate you saying that, I said. I think what I needed most wasn't really an apology for the word, though I appreciate that too. I think I needed you to actually understand why I was asking, instead of just complying with the boundary without us ever getting to the honest part underneath it. I think I understand it now, he said. I think I needed to actually say the real reason out loud to understand it myself. It's easier to just say someone's overreacting than to admit you've been getting something from a situation you knew, somewhere, wasn't quite right. I think about those months sometimes, the careful way I tried to frame that first conversation, the word that landed wrong despite my care, the slow process of getting past defensiveness to something honest underneath it. I don't think I handled every part of it perfectly. There were evenings where my vigilance tipped into something closer to suspicion than I was comfortable with, watching the clock, noticing his posture, becoming someone I didn't entirely recognize. But I'm glad I didn't simply accept the word controlling and back away from the conversation entirely, the way it would have been easier to do. I kept coming back to it, asking the question differently, until we got somewhere honest instead of just somewhere quiet. Maya asked me last month, with the specific bluntness of a 7-year-old, why Daddy doesn't take phone calls during dinner anymore. I told her it was because dinner time was our time, and that was true, and also not the whole story. And I think that's probably fine. Some things a marriage works through don't need to be fully explained to a 7-year-old. They just need to actually get worked through between the 2 adults who are in it.